Picture this. You're floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on Earth. Your boat has no engine, no mast, no sails. No way to steer, no radio to call for help, no GPS to tell you where you are. You have no food, no fresh water, and no idea which direction leads to land. How long do you think you could survive? Days? Weeks? Maybe a month if you're incredibly lucky. Now imagine surviving for 484 days, more than 15 months, drifting over 5,000 miles across the Pacific, from the coast of Japan to the shores of California. This isn't fiction, this isn't a movie. This is the true story of the longest sea drift in recorded human history. This is the story of Captain Oguri Jukichi and his crew, ordinary fishermen who became extraordinary survivors, men who stared death in the face every single day for over a year and refused to blink. Men who turned a broken fishing boat into a floating testament to the unbreakable human spirit. Their story was almost lost to history, but today we're bringing it back from the depths. Because sometimes the most incredible survival stories are the ones that time forgot. Get ready for a tale of courage, desperation, and impossible hope. A story that will make you question what the human body and spirit are truly capable of enduring. This is 484 Days Adrift, and it begins with a storm that changed everything. October 1813. The ports of Shizuoka, Japan. A world away from the industrial chaos that would soon engulf the globe, this was still a time when men lived by the rhythm of tides and seasons, when the ocean was both provider and master. Oguri Jukichi was exactly the kind of man you'd expect to find commanding a fishing vessel in early 19th century Japan. Weathered by sun and salt, with hands calloused from years of hauling nets and fighting storms. At 47 years old, he'd spent more of his life on water than on land. The sea was his office, his livelihood, and his passion. The Tokujo Maru wasn't much to look at. A modest wooden fishing boat, maybe 50 feet long, built for coastal waters and day trips. She had a single mast, basic sails, and room for a small crew. Nothing fancy, nothing designed for long voyages, just a working boat for working men. Jukichi's crew that October morning was small but experienced. There was Otokichi, a young sailor eager to prove himself. Kiyukichi, a veteran fisherman who'd sailed these waters for decades, and a few others whose names history would claim, but whose courage would live on in this story. The morning of their departure was perfect. Calm seas stretched to the horizon like polished glass. A gentle breeze filled their sails, just enough to push them steadily toward their fishing grounds. Seabirds wheeled overhead, and the familiar smell of salt and seaweed promised a productive day. They'd made this journey hundreds of times before. Out to the fishing grounds, cast their nets, bring home their catch. Simple, routine, safe. Jukichi stood at the bow, watching the coastline of Japan slowly fade behind them. He had no way of knowing he was seeing his homeland for the last time, no way of knowing that within hours everything would change forever. The first day passed without incident. Fish were plentiful, the weather held, and the crew was in good spirits. They anchored for the night in familiar waters, sharing rice and tea while planning the next day's work. The second day brought more of the same: perfect fishing weather, full nets, and the comfortable rhythm of men who knew their trade. As night fell on October 2nd, they were perhaps 30 miles off the Japanese coast, close enough to see land on the horizon, close enough to be home in a matter of hours. They had no idea they were about to be swept into an ocean that would become their prison for the next 484 days. That night, Jukichi noticed the wind picking up. Nothing unusual. Autumn storms were common in these waters. He ordered the nets secured and told the crew to get some rest. They'd ride out the blow and continue fishing when it passed. But as midnight approached, the wind didn't just pick up, it began to howl.
What happened next was every sailor's nightmare. The storm that hit the Tokuja Maru on October 3, 1813, wasn't just bad weather. It was nature unleashing its full fury on a tiny wooden boat and the men who dared to challenge the ocean. The wind went from strong to violent in a matter of hours. Waves that had been gentle swells became towering walls of water, rising 20, 30, 40 feet above the boat. The Tokuja Maru, built for coastal fishing, was completely overwhelmed. Jukichi and his crew fought desperately to keep their boat afloat. They battled to secure loose gear as waves crashed over the deck, filling the boat with freezing seawater. The mast, stressed beyond its limits, groaned and swayed with each impact. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. A massive wave, larger than any they'd seen, rose up like a liquid mountain. It struck the Tokuja Maru with the force of an avalanche, and when it passed, their mast was gone, snapped clean off, taking their sails with it into the churning darkness. Without the mast and sails, they had no way to control their direction. The boat became a cork in a bathtub, completely at the mercy of wind and current. But the storm wasn't finished with them yet. The rudder was next. The wooden steering mechanism, pounded by wave after wave, finally gave way. The timber that connected them to any hope of navigation splintered and was swallowed by the hungry sea. In a matter of hours, the Tokuja Maru had been transformed from a functioning fishing vessel into a helpless piece of driftwood. No mast, no sails, no rudder. No way to steer, no way to control their destiny. The storm raged for 3 days. 3 days of being tossed like a toy, of bailing water frantically just to stay afloat, of watching their supplies get soaked or washed overboard. When the winds finally calmed and the seas settled, the crew emerged from their ordeal to face a terrifying reality. They were alive, but they were lost. The coastline of Japan had vanished. In every direction, nothing but endless blue water stretched to the horizon. They had no idea where they were, which direction was home, or how far the storm had carried them. Jukichi gathered his remaining crew, some had been washed overboard during the worst of the storm, and took inventory. They had some dried rice, a small barrel of drinking water, basic fishing gear, and the clothes on their backs. That was it. Oh, and they had each other. 7 men, floating in the middle of nowhere, with no engine, no sails, and no way to get home. The current was carrying them steadily eastward, away from Japan, into the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Every hour took them further from any hope of rescue, deeper into an ocean that covers 1/3 of the planet's surface. As the reality of their situation sank in, some of the crew began to panic. Others fell into stunned silence. But Captain Jukichi, drawing on decades of experience and an inner strength he didn't know he possessed, made a decision that would define the next 485 days. They were going to survive this. Somehow, some way, they were going to find a way to live until rescue came. They were going to turn their broken boat into a lifeline and their desperation into determination. They were going to hold on. The first law of survival on a drifting boat is simple. Every single thing becomes precious. Every drop of water, every grain of rice, every piece of wood or rope or cloth takes on a value beyond measure. Because when you're floating in an endless ocean with no resupply coming, waste equals death. Tukichi and his crew learned this lesson fast. Their emergency food supply, the dried rice and pickled vegetables they'd brought for a 3-day fishing trip, had to last indefinitely. Tukichi instituted strict rationing immediately. Each man got a small handful of rice in the morning and another at night. Nothing more. It wasn't enough to satisfy hunger, but it might be enough to prevent starvation for a while. Water was even more critical. The small barrel they'd managed to save contained maybe 2 weeks' worth of drinking water for 7 men. In the vast Pacific, surrounded by water they couldn't drink, they were already dying of thirst. Rain became their salvation and their obsession. Every cloud was watched with desperate hope. When the skies finally opened, they spread every piece of cloth they could find to catch the precious drops. They used their mouths to drink directly from makeshift funnels. They learned to set up collection systems using torn sails and broken wood. But rain in the Pacific is unpredictable. Sometimes they'd go weeks without a drop, watching their water supply dwindle to nothing while they rationed it by the teaspoon. The boat itself became both their home and their tormentor. The Tokujo Maru's deck, constantly soaked by spray and rain, never dried completely. Salt crystals formed everywhere, turning every surface into a sandpaper that scraped their skin raw. The sun, reflecting off the water and the wet wood, became a merciless enemy that blistered their faces and hands. At night, with no shelter from the wind, they huddled together for warmth. During the day, they rigged whatever shade they could find from scraps of sail and clothing. The temperature extremes were brutal, freezing cold after sunset, scorching hot by midday. But perhaps the cruelest challenge was the psychological torture of the horizon. In every direction, nothing but water. No land, no ships, no sign that the rest of the world even existed. Just an endless blue prison with no walls and no escape. The first man died after 6 weeks. Kyukichi, the veteran fisherman who'd sailed these waters for decades, simply couldn't adapt to the starvation diet and constant exposure.
His body, worn down by years of hard work, couldn't find the reserves needed for this new kind of survival. He grew weaker and weaker until one morning he simply didn't wake up. The decision of what to do with his body was agonizing. In Japanese culture, proper burial rites are sacred, but they were floating in the middle of an ocean with no land in sight. After a brief ceremony honoring their friend and colleague, they committed Kyukichi to the sea. His death was a brutal reminder of what they were all facing. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience. This was a fight for their lives, and they were losing crew members to an enemy they couldn't see or fight directly. 2 more men died in the following weeks. Starvation, exposure, and despair claimed them one by one. Each death was a devastating blow to the survivors, but also a terrible calculation. Fewer mouths to feed meant the remaining supplies would last longer. By the end of their 2nd month adrift, only 4 men remained alive: Captain Tokichi, young Otokichi, and 2 others whose strength and will had proven equal to the ocean's challenges. 4 men on a broken boat, still more than 400 days away from rescue. But they were still alive, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the vast blue emptiness that surrounded them. They had learned the first rule of their floating hell. Survival isn't about being comfortable. It's about being alive for one more day. By their 3rd month adrift, the men of the Tokujo Maru had become something their former selves wouldn't recognize: masters of improvisation, experts in making something from nothing, specialists in the kind of survival skills that humans rarely need to develop. Their original food supplies were long gone. The rice had been stretched as far as possible, but you can't make something last forever when forever might actually happen. They faced a simple choice: find new sources of food or die. The ocean, which had seemed like their enemy, gradually revealed itself as a reluctant provider. Fish were the obvious target, but catching them with no proper fishing gear required creativity that bordered on genius. They carefully unraveled threads from their clothing to make fishing line. Bones from the fish they caught became hooks. Strips of cloth became lures. Jukichi, drawing on decades of fishing experience, taught the others to read the water. Certain colors meant certain types of fish. Ripples on the surface indicated schools below. Birds diving in specific patterns meant feeding activity they could exploit. But fish were unpredictable. Sometimes they'd catch enough to feast, other times they'd go days without a single bite. They learned to dry and preserve their catches, using the sun and salt spray to create a rudimentary form of jerky that could last weeks. Seaweed became a staple. The various forms of marine vegetation that floated past their boat were tested, tasted, and cataloged. Some varieties were edible, others were toxic. Through trial and error, sometimes painful error, they built a mental database of what the ocean offered. Birds became an unexpected food source. Seabirds, exhausted from long flights across the Pacific, would occasionally land on their boat to rest. These moments became life-and-death hunting opportunities. Moving slowly and carefully, the survivors would try to catch these visitors bare-handed. Every successful capture meant protein, but also something equally valuable: hope. Each bird caught was proof that they could still provide for themselves, that they weren't completely helpless. The boat itself became their workshop. Every piece of broken wood, every scrap of rope, every torn piece of sail was repurposed. They plugged leaks with cloth stuffed into gaps between planks. They created storage containers from pieces of the hull. They built simple tools from debris. Water collection became an art form. They learned to predict weather patterns, to set up their cloth collection systems before the first drops fell. They discovered that morning dew, carefully collected, could provide just enough moisture to survive on cloudless days. Their bodies adapted in ways that would amaze modern doctors. Their metabolism slowed dramatically, allowing them to survive on a fraction of normal caloric intake. Their skin, constantly exposed to salt and sun, became like leather. Their reflexes sharpened as every moment became about survival. But perhaps most remarkably, their minds adapted too. They developed an almost supernatural patience. Hours could pass in complete silence as they waited for fish to bite or clouds to form. They learned to find entertainment in the smallest things, the patterns of waves, the behavior of seabirds, the changing colors of the sky. They told stories to pass time and keep their spirits up. Jukichi shared tales of his years at sea. Otokichi talked about his family and his dreams for the future. They sang songs from their childhood, recited poetry, and played simple games with bits of wood and rope. These weren't just distractions, they were survival tools. Maintaining their humanity, their connection to culture and community, was as important as finding food and water. Men who lose hope die, even when their bodies could survive longer. By their 6th month adrift, they had transformed from desperate castaways into something unprecedented, a fully functional society on a drifting boat. They had rules, routines, and systems. They had adapted to their environment so completely that the impossible had become merely difficult. But they were still in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, still drifting eastward with no land in sight, still facing the daily reality that each sunrise might be their last. The question was no longer whether they could survive day to day. The question was whether their incredible adaptations would be enough to last until rescue found them in the vast emptiness of the Pacific.
The Pacific Ocean is not just large, it's incomprehensibly vast. Covering more than 60 million square miles, it's larger than all the land masses on Earth combined. To put that in perspective, you could fit the entire continent of Africa into the Pacific and still have room for Europe, Asia, and both Americas. For the survivors of the Tokujo Maru, these weren't just statistics. This vastness was their daily reality, their constant companion, and their greatest enemy. By their 8th month adrift, something devastating began to happen to their minds. The endless horizon, the unchanging routine of survival, the complete absence of any sign that the outside world existed, it all began to take a psychological toll that was almost harder to bear than the physical hardships. Otokichi was the first to start seeing things that weren't there. Ships on the horizon that vanished when you looked directly at them, islands that turned out to be clouds, lights in the distance that were just reflections of stars on water. These hallucinations weren't signs of madness, they were signs of hope struggling to survive in an environment designed to crush it. The human mind, desperate for stimulation and variation, began creating what it needed to see. But false hope can be crueler than no hope at all. One morning, in their 9th month, they spotted what appeared to be debris floating in the distance. Wood planks, rope, maybe pieces of a ship's hull. This could only mean one thing. They were in shipping lanes. Where there was debris, there might be ships. Where there were ships, there was rescue. They spent 3 days maneuvering their boat toward the debris, using makeshift paddles and shifting their weight to catch favorable currents. It was exhausting work, but the possibility of rescue drove them beyond their normal limits.
When they finally reached the floating wood, their hearts sank. It wasn't ship debris at all, just driftwood, probably torn from some distant coastline by storms months or years ago. Like them, it was just floating aimlessly in the endless Pacific. But even worse than the disappointment was what they found next. Carved into one of the larger pieces of wood were Japanese characters. Someone had written their name and hometown on this piece of driftwood before it was lost to the sea. They were looking at someone else's message in a bottle, someone else's desperate hope for rescue. And here it was, floating thousands of miles from home, a testament to the ocean's vast indifference to human suffering. The psychological impact was devastating. If this piece of wood had been floating out here for years without anyone finding it, what hope did they have? Jukichi, seeing his remaining crew sinking into despair, made a decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of focusing on the message of hopelessness, he focused on what the driftwood could provide: more wood for repairs, dry material for kindling, resources they could use to improve their chances of survival. "We are not that piece of wood," he told his men. "We are alive. We think. We adapt. We fight back. Wood just floats. We survive." But the challenges to their sanity were relentless. Day after day of identical horizons, night after night of the same stars, week after week with no variation, no stimulation, no sign that anything existed beyond their small boat and the endless water. They began to lose track of time. Without calendars or clocks, with no regular schedule except the rising and setting of the sun, days blurred together into an endless present. Had they been out here for 8 months or 9? Was it still 1813, or had 1814 begun? Some days brought tantalizing glimpses of what might be hope. A bird flying in a straight line, perhaps heading toward land. A change in the color of the water, maybe indicating shallower depths near a coastline. Floating seaweed of a type they hadn't seen before, possibly from a different region. Each of these signs would trigger desperate hope, followed inevitably by crushing disappointment when land failed to materialize. The most devastating false alarm came in their 10th month. Otokichi, now the youngest and strongest of the remaining survivors, spotted what he was certain was a sail on the horizon. Not a hallucination this time, a real ship. White sail clearly visible against the blue sky. They waved frantically with pieces of cloth. They shouted until their voices gave out. They built a signal fire from their precious dry wood reserves, sending smoke into the clear sky. For 6 hours they watched that sail, convinced their ordeal was finally over. They talked about what they would eat first, who they would contact, how they would get home to Japan. As the day progressed, the sail grew larger and more distinct. But something was wrong. It wasn't moving like a ship should move. It wasn't responding to their signals. As afternoon faded into evening, the horrible truth became clear. It wasn't a sail at all. It was an unusual cloud formation, a trick of light and perspective that had created the perfect illusion of rescue. When night fell and the sail dissolved into darkness, leaving them still alone on the endless Pacific, something inside them broke. Not permanently, they were too strong for that, but deeply enough to leave scars that would never fully heal.
Month 12. A full year since the storm destroyed their lives and set them adrift in the Pacific.
The anniversary passed without celebration, without recognition, almost without notice. Time had become meaningless when you've lost all reference points for what time means. Of the original crew of 7, only 3 remained: Jukichi, young Otokichi, and one other man whose name history is lost, but whose endurance matched theirs. 3 survivors in various stages of physical and mental breakdown, still floating eastward toward an uncertain fate. Their appearance would have shocked anyone who'd known them before. Jukichi, once a robust sea captain, now weighed perhaps half his original weight. His skin was burnt black by the sun and cracked like old leather from constant salt exposure. His hair and beard had turned completely white, and his eyes had sunk deep into his skull. Otokichi, despite his youth, looked like an old man. Starvation had carved away every ounce of extra flesh, leaving him gaunt and skeletal. But his spirit remained unbroken, and he had become their primary fisherman and water collector. The boat itself was falling apart around them. The Tokujo Maru had never been designed for a year of constant exposure to Pacific storms and swells. Planks were loose, gaps had opened between boards, and only constant bailing kept them afloat. They had cannibalized parts of the boat to make repairs, but they were running out of material to work with. Their survival systems, refined over months of practice, were beginning to fail. Fish seemed to be getting scarcer, or perhaps they were drifting through less productive waters. Rain had become less frequent, and their water reserves were constantly at dangerous levels. But the most serious threat wasn't physical. It was psychological. After a year of false hopes and crushing disappointments, after 365 days of scanning the horizon for rescue that never came, something fundamental was breaking down in their minds. The human psyche isn't designed to maintain hope indefinitely in the face of overwhelming evidence that hope is pointless. Otokichi had begun talking to people who weren't there. Not hallucinations exactly, but conversations with family members back in Japan, discussions with crew members who had died months earlier. He would spend hours explaining their situation to his mother, describing their daily routine to his deceased friend, Jukichi. The third survivor had stopped talking altogether. He performed his survival tasks mechanically, bailing water, checking the fishing lines, collecting dew, but he no longer engaged with his companions. He had retreated so far into himself that he seemed more like a survival automaton than a human being. Even Jukichi, the rock upon which their survival had been built, was showing cracks. He had begun to obsess over navigation, trying to calculate their position and predict their drift using methods that grew more elaborate and less connected to reality each day. He would spend hours arranging pieces of wood and rope in patterns that he claimed represented ocean currents and wind patterns, muttering calculations that made sense only to him. The worst part was the growing certainty that they were never going to be rescued. After a full year adrift, they had seen no ships, no aircraft, no sign that anyone was looking for them. They had drifted so far from any shipping lanes that even if vessels passed nearby, the chances of being spotted were virtually zero. This realization led to conversations that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Should they give up? Should they stop fighting and let the ocean claim them? Would it be more merciful to end their suffering rather than drag it out indefinitely? These weren't moments of weakness. They were moments of brutal honesty about their situation. 3 men on a disintegrating boat in the middle of the world's largest ocean with no realistic hope of rescue, slowly starving and dying of exposure. But each time these conversations arose, something deep within them would respond. Call it stubbornness, call it hope, call it the fundamental human refusal to surrender. Whatever it was, it kept them going. Jukichi would remember his family waiting for him in Japan. Otokichi would think about the stories he wanted to tell if he ever made it home. Their silent companion would simply return to his tasks, his mechanical survival routine serving as a form of meditation that kept despair at bay. They had reached the point where survival was no longer about hope for rescue. It was about something more fundamental, the simple refusal to quit, the stubborn insistence that as long as they were breathing, they would keep fighting. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to enter the most dangerous phase of their ordeal. Month 12 through month 16 would test every adaptation they had made, every survival skill they had learned, every ounce of mental strength they had built up. The Pacific had been playing with them for a year. Now it was going to try to finish them. But they were no longer the frightened fishermen who had been caught in that storm 12 months ago. They had been forged by hardship into something new, something harder, something that the ocean might not be able to break. They were going to hold on.
Winter in the North Pacific is not a season. It's a declaration of war against anything foolish enough to be caught on the surface. As the survivors entered their second winter adrift, they faced storms that made their original disaster seem like a gentle shower. Waves 60 feet high crashed over their boat. Winds strong enough to strip bark from trees howled across the water. Rain fell so hard it was like being pelted with gravel. And through it all, 3 skeletal men on the disintegrating boat somehow found the strength to keep fighting. The storms came in series, one after another, with barely enough calm between them to bail out the boat and catch their breath. For days at a time, they would be soaked to the bone, battered by waves, and unable to do anything but hold on and try not to be washed overboard. Their boat, already weakened by over a year of abuse, began to come apart under the assault. Planks that had been loose became completely detached. Gaps between boards opened into actual holes. The remaining structure groaned and flexed with each wave, threatening to simply break apart and dump them into the churning sea. They had no materials left for major repairs. Every piece of rope, every scrap of cloth, every spare bit of wood had been used months ago. They were reduced to stuffing their own clothing into the worst gaps, using their bodies as human plugs to keep the Pacific from claiming their boat. The cold was perhaps the worst part. In the tropical Pacific, they had battled heat and sun exposure. But in the northern waters, where the currents had carried them, winter temperatures dropped well below anything their tropical adapted bodies could handle. They had no warm clothing, no shelter from the wind, no way to get dry. Hypothermia became a constant threat. They would huddle together for warmth, sharing what little body heat they could generate. They learned to recognize the signs of dangerous cold in each other, the shivering that suddenly stops, the confusion, the drowsiness that signals the body shutting down. Food became almost impossible to obtain. Fish didn't bite in the storm conditions. Seaweed was scarce in the winter waters. Birds were rare, and those that did appear were too exhausted by the storms to be easily caught.
They were reduced to eating things that would have disgusted them months earlier. Barnacles scraped from the hull of their boat, strange gelatinous creatures that washed aboard during storms, anything organic, anything that might provide a few calories to keep their bodies functioning. Water, paradoxically, became scarce even though they were surrounded by falling rain. The storms made it impossible to set up their collection systems properly. Rain mixed with seawater became undrinkable. They were forced to catch water with their cupped hands, mouths open to the sky, grabbing every drop they could while being pounded by waves. It was during this winter that they lost their third survivor. The man who had retreated into silence, who had performed his survival tasks with mechanical precision for over a year, simply couldn't adapt to the new level of hardship. The combination of cold, starvation, and the constant battering of the storms overwhelmed his already weakened system. He died during a particularly brutal night, probably from a combination of hypothermia and exhaustion. When morning came and the storm had passed, Jukichi and Otokichi found themselves alone on a barely floating wreck, with only each other for company in the vast Pacific. The death of their companion was devastating, but it also marked a turning point. With only 2 survivors left, they could pool their meager resources. 2 men required less food and water than 3. And perhaps most importantly, they no longer had to maintain morale for someone who had given up hope. Jukichi and Otokichi could focus entirely on survival. They developed new strategies for the winter conditions. They learned to read storm patterns and prepare accordingly. They found ways to repair their boat using techniques that would have seemed impossible months earlier. They discovered methods of staying warm that pushed the boundaries of human physiology. Most crucially, they maintained their partnership. In conditions that could have easily turned them against each other, they remained allies. They shared everything equally. They looked out for each other's welfare. They refused to let despair drive a wedge between them. As winter slowly gave way to spring, and the storms became less frequent, and the temperatures began to rise, Captain Jukichi and young Otokichi found themselves still alive, still afloat, and still drifting eastward across the Pacific. They had survived 16 months adrift. They had outlasted storms that sank proper ships. They had adapted to conditions that should have killed them a dozen times over. But they were still in the middle of the ocean, still thousands of miles from any land, still facing the daily possibility that each sunrise might be their last. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to enter their final phase of the ordeal. The currents and winds that had carried them east for so long were about to deliver them to the most unlikely rescue in maritime history.
March 1815. 16 months and 10 days since their ordeal began. Captain Jukichi and Otokichi had become something that existed nowhere in any survival manual. Humans who had adapted so completely to life on a drifting boat that they were no longer quite the men they had been. They were skeletons covered by sun-blackened leather. Their hair was white as sea foam, their eyes bright with a knowledge that came from staring death in the face every day for over 500 days. They moved with the careful economy of motion that comes from having no energy to waste. Every gesture was purposeful, every action calculated for maximum survival benefit. Their boat was held together by willpower and prayer. The Tokujo Maru was no longer recognizable as the vessel that had left Japan so long ago. It was a collection of boards and rope and cloth that somehow still floated, a testament to the ingenuity of desperate men and the stubborn refusal of wood to completely surrender to the sea. But something was changing. After more than a year of drifting in the endless blue emptiness of the mid-Pacific, they were beginning to see signs that suggested, what? Land? Shipping lanes? Rescue? The birds were different. Instead of the occasional exhausted seabirds that had provided rare protein during their ordeal, they were seeing more species, more frequently. Birds flying with purpose in consistent directions. Birds that suggested nearby land where they could nest and feed. The water itself was changing color subtly. The deep blue of the open ocean was giving way to slightly different shades that experienced sailors like Jukichi could read like a book. Shallower water, different currents, possible proximity to a continental shelf. Debris was becoming more common, not the random driftwood they had encountered before, but pieces that looked like they might have come from human activity. Worked wood, rope that had been manufactured rather than improvised, signs that somewhere people were building things and using the ocean. But after 16 months of false hopes and crushing disappointments, they had learned not to let optimism overcome caution. These signs might mean rescue was near, or they might mean nothing at all. The Pacific had taught them that hope without evidence was just another form of torture. They continued their routine, catch what fish they could, collect every drop of rainwater, repair the boat with whatever materials they could find or create, survive one more day. The weather was improving as spring advanced, fewer violent storms, more predictable patterns, temperatures that didn't threaten immediate hypothermia. After the brutal winter that had nearly killed them, the milder conditions felt like a gift from the gods. But their bodies were failing in new ways. 16 months of malnutrition had effects that go beyond simple starvation. Their teeth were loose. Their eyesight was deteriorating. Their joints ached constantly. Diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies were beginning to manifest in ways they didn't understand. They were surviving, but they were slowly dying from the inside out. Otokichi, despite his youth, was showing signs that worried Jukichi deeply. The young man would sometimes forget where they were or how long they had been adrift. He would start conversations with people who weren't there, then suddenly snap back to reality with no memory of what he had been doing. Jukichi himself was struggling with coordination problems. Simple tasks that he had performed thousands of times during their ordeal were becoming difficult. His hands would shake, his balance would fail, his mind would wander in ways that could be fatal in their environment. They were reaching the absolute limits of human endurance. Whatever reserves of strength and determination had carried them through 16 months of hell were finally running out. And then, on the morning of March 24th, 1815, Otokichi spotted something on the horizon that wasn't a cloud, wasn't a hallucination, and wasn't a trick of light on water. It was a ship. A real ship with real sails moving under human control across the surface of the Pacific. After 484 days of abandonment, after more than a year of believing they were completely alone in the vast ocean, they were looking at proof that the rest of the world still existed. The question was, could they attract its attention? Could two half-dead men on a disintegrating boat signal effectively to their only chance of rescue? Everything they had endured, every day they had survived, every moment they had refused to give up, had led to this single opportunity. They were about to discover if 484 days of holding on had been enough.
The ship was maybe 3 miles away, still just a speck of white sail against the vast blue horizon. But to Captain Jukichi and Otokichi, it might as well have been an angel descending from heaven. After 484 days of scanning that horizon for exactly this moment, after more than a year of false hopes and crushing disappointments, they were looking at their salvation. The only question was whether salvation would notice them. They had perhaps an hour, maybe 2, before the ship would pass beyond any possibility of contact. 1 hour to attract attention across 3 miles of ocean. 1 hour to signal effectively despite having almost no energy, no proper signaling equipment, and a boat that was barely afloat. Everything depended on the next 60 minutes. They moved with desperate efficiency, calling on reserves of strength they didn't know they still possessed. Every piece of cloth on their boat, torn sails, shredded clothing, strips of fabric they had saved for repairs, was gathered together and tied into the largest signal flag they could create. Otokichi, despite his weakened condition, climbed to the highest point on their makeshift mast and began waving frantically. The effort was enormous for a man who hadn't had a proper meal in over a year, but adrenaline and desperation gave him strength. Jukichi built a signal fire using their emergency reserves of dry wood, materials they had hoarded for over a year, saving them for exactly this moment. The smoke rose thin and white against the clear sky, a fragile thread connecting their floating prison to the possibility of rescue. They shouted until their voices gave out, even though they knew the sound couldn't possibly carry across the water. They waved their makeshift flag until their arms cramped. They did everything humanly possible to say, "Here, we're here, don't leave us." For 30 agonizing minutes, the ship continued on its original course. No change in direction, no response to their signals, no sign that anyone aboard had noticed 2 dying men desperately trying to attract attention. The ship was American. They could tell from the design of the sails and the way it sat in the water. The brig, Forester, though they didn't know its name yet, was heading northeast, probably bound for California with a cargo of trade goods. As the minutes passed and the ship maintained its course, despair began to creep back into their hearts. They had found rescue, only to watch it sail away. The cosmic cruelty of the situation was almost unbearable. But then, a change, a subtle shift in the ship's course. Someone aboard had spotted something unusual on the horizon. Captain William Davis of the Forester had been at sea long enough to recognize when something didn't belong. The smoke, the irregular movement of what looked like debris, the flash of something that might be cloth catching the sunlight, these things deserved investigation. As the American ship altered course toward them, Jukichi and Otokichi collapsed onto the deck of their boat, overwhelmed with emotions they had kept suppressed for over a year. Relief, gratitude, disbelief, and above all, the stunning realization that they were going to live. They were going to see Japan again. They were going to tell their story. They were going to honor the memory of their companions who hadn't survived to see this moment. As the Forester drew closer, its crew could hardly believe what they were seeing. The wreck they were approaching didn't look like it could possibly support human life. The boat was more holes than hull, held together by rope and prayer. It looked like something that should have sunk months ago. But there were people aboard, 2 skeletal figures, waving weakly, clearly alive, despite appearing more dead than living. Captain Davis ordered a boat lowered immediately. His crew rowed across the calm water toward what would become one of the most extraordinary rescues in maritime history. When the American sailors pulled alongside the Tokujo Maru, they were shocked into silence. The 2 survivors looked like living skeletons. Their skin was burned black by sun and salt, their hair bleached white, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls. They were clearly starving, dehydrated, and suffering from exposure that should have killed them long ago. But they were alive, incredibly, impossibly, miraculously alive. Jukichi tried to speak, but found he had no voice left. Otokichi attempted to bow in the traditional Japanese manner of greeting, but nearly collapsed from the effort. They gestured frantically at their boat, trying to communicate their desperate need for help. The American sailors needed no translation. They carefully lifted the 2 survivors into their boat, supporting them gently while marveling at how little they weighed. These men felt like children in their arms, all bones and sinew with no flesh left. As they rowed toward the Forester, Captain Davis asked the question that every sailor would ask: "How long have you been out there?" Through gestures and broken attempts at communication, Jukichi managed to convey an impossible answer: more than a year, over 400 days. Longer than anyone had ever survived adrift in the open ocean. When they were brought aboard the Forester, the American crew gathered in amazement around the 2 survivors. These weren't just castaways, they were living proof of what human beings could endure when death was the only alternative to survival. Hot food was brought immediately, though they had to be careful not to overwhelm digestive systems that had adapted to starvation. Fresh water was provided in small, careful amounts. Blankets were wrapped around bodies that had forgotten what warmth felt like. But perhaps most importantly, they were surrounded by human faces, human voices, human kindness, after 484 days of having only each other for company. Captain Jukichi and Otokichi had been rescued. After the longest recorded sea drift in human history, after surviving conditions that killed 5 of their 7 original crew members, after enduring hardships that seemed beyond the limits of human endurance, they were safe. Their impossible journey was over.
The rescue of Captain Oguri Jukichi and Otokichi on March 24, 1815, marked the end of the longest sea drift in recorded human history. 484 days, 16 months and 10 days, over 5,000 miles from the coast of Japan to the waters off California. But their story was far from over. The American crew of the Forester treated them with the utmost care during the voyage to California. Slowly, carefully, they nursed the 2 survivors back to something resembling health. Hot food, fresh water, warm beds, and human companionship began the long process of healing bodies and minds that had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. When they reached the California coast, Jukichi and Otokichi became celebrities of sorts. Their story spread through the ports and trading posts of the Pacific. 2 Japanese fishermen who had survived the impossible, who had drifted across the world's largest ocean and lived to tell about it. But their story was far from over. Getting home to Japan proved to be another challenge entirely. This was 1815, when international travel was complicated by politics, language barriers, and the simple logistics of moving people across vast distances. It would take additional months, additional ships, and additional acts of kindness from strangers before they finally set foot on Japanese soil again. When they did return, they found a world that had almost forgotten them. Their families had mourned them as dead. Their names had been carved on memorial stones. For all practical purposes, they were ghosts returning from the grave. The Japan they returned to was also changing. The isolation that had defined Japanese culture for centuries was beginning to crack under pressure from the outside world. In a strange way, Jukichi and Otokichi were harbingers of a new era. Japanese citizens who had survived in the wider world and lived to bring back tales of what lay beyond their island nation. Their story was recorded by Japanese officials, preserved for history as one of the most remarkable survival tales ever documented. But for the survivors themselves, the return to normal life was perhaps the greatest challenge they faced. How do you return to ordinary concerns after 484 days when every moment was about life and death? How do you complain about minor inconveniences when you've survived on seaweed and rainwater for over a year? How do you relate to people who have never faced the absolute limit of human endurance? Jukichi lived for many more years, but he was never quite the same man who had set out fishing in October 1813. The ocean had marked him in ways that went deeper than the scars on his sun-damaged skin. He had seen the worst that nature could offer, and had refused to surrender. That knowledge changes a person in fundamental ways. Otokichi, despite his youth, carried similar burdens. The boy who had been swept to sea became a man who understood survival in ways that most people never need to learn. He too lived a long life, but always with the knowledge that he had survived something that should have been impossible. But what does their story mean for us today, more than 200 years later? In our modern world of GPS and satellite phones, of coast guards and search and rescue operations, it's easy to think that stories like theirs belong to a distant past. We have technology now. We have safety systems. We have ways to prevent such tragedies and respond when they occur. But the truth is, life still tests us in ways that no technology can solve. We still face situations where the only choice is to hold on or give up. We still encounter circumstances where our only resources are our own determination and the support of those around us. Cancer patients undergoing treatment that seems endless. Families struggling through economic hardship that stretches on month after month. People dealing with depression or addiction or loss that seems insurmountable. Anyone who has ever felt lost in a situation too big for them to handle alone. The story of Jukichi and Otokichi reminds us that human beings are capable of surviving things that seem impossible, not because we're naturally strong, but because we can choose to keep fighting even when fighting seems pointless. They survived 484 days adrift not because they were superhuman, but because they refused to give up. They adapted when adaptation seemed impossible. They supported each other when they had nothing left to give. They maintained hope when hope appeared to be delusion. They held on. They held on when the storm destroyed their boat. They held on when their companions died. They held on through starvation and exposure and the psychological torture
of endless empty horizons. They held on through winter storms that should have killed them, and false hopes that nearly broke their spirits. They held on until rescue found them. In our Hold On Survival Stories series, we've seen this pattern again and again. Ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, situations that seem hopeless, conditions that push human endurance beyond its natural limits. And yet, again and again, we see the same truth. The human spirit is stronger than we imagine. Not always, not for everyone, but often enough to remind us that giving up is never the only option. Jukichi and Otokichi survived 484 days, not because they were superhuman, but because they chose every single day for 484 days to keep living. They chose to adapt rather than surrender. They chose to support each other rather than turn inward. They chose hope over despair, action over resignation, determination over defeat. Their story is proof that sometimes when everything else is lost, when all the systems have failed and all the plans have fallen apart, there's still one thing left that can save you. The simple, stubborn, magnificent refusal to let go. This has been Hold On Survival Stories. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey across the Pacific with Captain Jukichi and Otokichi. If their story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others who need to be reminded that no matter how vast the ocean of problems seems, no matter how distant rescue appears, no matter how long you've been drifting, your moment of salvation might be just beyond the horizon. Until next time, remember, when the storms hit and the current carries you far from everything familiar, when you're down to your last reserves and hope seems like a luxury you can't afford, hold on.